Hello and welcome. In this episode, I am going to share encounters where people believe they came across a Wendigo, but what they really saw was a Wechuge. These stories include a young woman who had something try to reach out and grab her, two boys who saw a strange creature outside one of their homes one night, a poster who found some bizarre footprints in the snow, and three friends who were chased out of the forest by a huge creature. But first, we start with a story from a young woman who came face to face with a creature while walking through the woods one night. Also, if you'd like to help support the channel, click on the join button below. Alright, let's get into today's stories. The first story of this episode comes to us from Michigan, which I have joked about being the dogman capital of the world. But it would seem that it might just be the cryptid capital of the world, as I am starting to see more and more stories coming from the state about a variety of cryptids and not just dogman. This story takes place in the lower parts of Michigan, where the original poster, or OP, came face to face with a creature she originally thought to be a Wendigo. But I believe she saw something else entirely. She does not say where exactly her story takes place, just that she lives in a township that has little trails in the area leading deep into the forest, and also other trails that act as a shortcut to other parts of town. The night of her encounter, she was on one of the trails leading deeper into the forest, riding her bike and using her flashlight to light her way. She had an area she liked to go to she refers to as her sitting area, which included a tree with a branch that looked like a swing. When she arrived at her spot, she was moving her bike closer to the tree when she made eye contact with a creature. At least she thinks she was looking at this thing's eyes. She couldn't see the body, but she saw this thing's face, which she describes as being a skull with thick antlers. She froze in place, staring at this creature for about 5 minutes, according to her, before it let out a screech. She wasted no time getting out of there on her bike and went straight home. She says she believes the creature was a Wendigo, but she wasn't sure if it even was a Wendigo. She ends her post by asking if anyone can explain what exactly she made eye contact with that night. She then provides an update on her situation in a second post, saying she did some research and believes the creature she saw was in fact a Wendigo. She tried to return to the area where she saw this thing, but the trail was blocked off right before reaching the spot where she came face to face with whatever this thing was. She doesn't know why the area was blocked off and asked her town's newspaper, but was unable to find out anything. She also says she thinks she has seen this thing around since her encounter and wants to further investigate, being that she has always been intrigued by the unknown. She has been in contact with a friend about what happened to her and trying to find out more information about Wendigo. Her friend told her that she should not speak that name. She ends her second post by asking if anyone has any tips or advice and if she should continue to investigate what happened to her or if she should just leave it alone. She wonders what she is supposed to do and thinks this thing may be stalking her because it sees her as prey. She is unable to pack up and move and doesn't know what to do. To answer her question from her first post, I believe this creature was a Wechuge, which is a cryptid often misidentified as a Wendigo due to pop culture and movies making them out to have skull-like faces and antlers. Wendigo do not have antlers or skull-like faces. It is said, however, that they sometimes wear the skulls of animals when they are hunting. But this is the only time they would appear to have a face resembling a skull. Wendigo actually look closer in appearance to a crawler, whereas Wechuge have heads that are skulls with antlers, as described in this story. In a response to a commenter, the OP says she lives in an area known to have skinwalkers, ghosts, and Wendigo. She had heard many stories about them, but had never seen one until that fateful night. She now refuses to leave the house after dark or even if the sun is starting to set. She ends her reply by saying she hates that state so much. And who can blame her? An encounter like this would shake anyone to their core, and Michigan seems to be the state for cryptid encounters. To answer the questions from her second post, I absolutely would not try to further investigate this or seek out this creature. If it has taken an interest in her, that would only make it take that much more of an interest. The best thing she can do is ignore this thing and continue to not go out after dark. Usually, if these things are ignored, they lose interest and move on. I think she's doing the smart thing by not going out at night. If it were me, I'd probably stay out of that forest entirely. What do you think she saw out there that night? A Wendigo, Wechuge, or something else? And what advice would you give her? The next story comes from a poster who had a terrifying experience while out on a walk. She believes she saw a Wendigo, but given her description of the creature, it would seem to be something else entirely. She does not say where her story takes place. While on her walk, she had taken a turn down a road that was slightly darker than the rest, that had woods on one side and houses on the other. There was a roundabout in the road, and as she approached it, she saw what looked like a deer. She says in her post she even said, "Oh, a deer," but that spooked it and it disappeared into the brush. Curious, she approached the area to get a closer look at the deer so she could count its antlers. But when she got close to the brush the deer had run into, she was hit with an awful smell she describes as smelling like manure and a dead animal, admitting that saying it smelled like a dead animal sounds very cliche. That's when she looked into the brush and saw what was really there. What she saw looking back at her was the skeletal face of something resembling a deer. Then a shadowy hand with claws began reaching out toward her, and that's when she turned and ran away, trying to get as far away from this thing as possible. The title of her post says she thinks she saw a Wendigo that night, but I think this was something else entirely. This to me sounds like a Wechuge, especially given the skeletal face that looked like a deer. She doesn't say it had antlers, but she did say it looked like a deer, which makes me think that it did. Plus, she thought it was a Wendigo, and the common misconception about their appearance is that they have a skull for a face and head and antlers, making them resemble a deer. The fact that it started reaching out toward her gives me chills. There's no telling what would have happened if she had not run away. She probably wouldn't have been around to post her story online. Luckily though, this was not the case and she was able to make it out of there safely. What do you think she saw that night? The next story comes from a poster who believes he and his friend encountered a Wendigo one night in southern Maryland. But after hearing the description of the creature they had the misfortune of crossing paths with, you'll see why I included it with other Wechuge stories. He does not say where exactly his story takes place, just that the encounter took place at his friend's house and his friend lives deep in a forest. He also notes that his friend has a lot of dogs that live outdoors. He was spending the night at his friend's house when they started hearing his dogs go crazy outside at about 2:30 in the morning. The OP and his friend looked out the window to see what the dogs were barking at and saw something they will never forget. He describes the creature as being a tall moose, except there are no moose in Maryland. But what solidified that this thing was not a moose was that it had absolutely no flesh on its face. There was only a skull visible where its face should have been. The boys then watched as this moose walked behind a tree and disappeared from sight after they yelled at it. The boys immediately ran outside and over to the spot where they saw this creature, but there was no sign that the thing had even been there. Not even a single track. But the OP says he and his friend know what they saw. The OP says in his post that he ruled out Skinwalker pretty quick, being that he lives in southern Maryland, believing they saw a Wendigo that night. However, given his description of the creature, I believe it to be a Wechuge. He describes it as looking like a moose with a skull face. He doesn't say anything about antlers, but moose have antlers, so it seems plausible to assume this being did have them. Given that there is a misconception about what a Wendigo looks like, I don't blame the OP for thinking that's what this creature was. It does fit with what people think is a Wendigo and how they are depicted, but are actually Wechuge. What do you think about this one? And what do you think the boys saw that night? The next story doesn't have an actual sighting of a creature, but the original poster did find some very bizarre footprints in the snow he believes belonged to a Wendigo. However, there are a couple of commenters who point out something interesting regarding the footprints that I would have to agree with. It was in the middle of winter when the OP was out on a walk with his older brother. Snow covered just about every part of the ground he could see. The OP enjoys spotting animals from time to time and taking pictures when he can, but his phone was all but dead at the time. He didn't mind and continued looking for various animals, spotting a group of foxes. But that's when he came across some very bizarre looking footprints in the snow. His first thought was that he had come across some bear prints, but he quickly realized they were way too big to be a bear. He says they look like deer prints, but were unnaturally big. Whatever made those prints now has him a little freaked out to go back into those woods. He ends his post by asking if he came across the footsteps of a Wendigo. Two commenters pointed out, and I agree with what they said, that Wendigo are not deer-like, so they would not have left prints shaped like that of a deer. One of the commenters suggested that maybe it was a Wechuge, being that they are described as looking similar to a deer in some regards, their feet included. However, I can't say for certain that's what the prints belong to, as there was no physical sighting of the creature that left them. But given that the prints were big enough for him to at first think they belonged to a bear, it very well could have been a cryptid. However, I can't completely disregard that these footprints could have been left by another animal. What do you think these footprints belong to? The final story of this episode comes from a young man who was chased by a creature he and his friends believed to be a Wechuge. He posted his story online seemingly just to get it off his chest, but it seems like he is seeking some advice on how to proceed. He does not say where his story takes place, just that he lives in Canada and he was 15 years old at the time of his encounter. The OP and his two friends were on their way home from an abandoned farm they were hanging out at that night. Their path was taking them through a stretch of dark forest that had them kind of freaked out, being that it was so dark and they were alone. Or at least they thought they were alone. The OP had fallen behind his friends but decided he didn't want to be in the back of the procession, so he took off running and ran past both of his friends. They followed suit and soon all three boys were running down the trail. One of his friends caught up to him, but the other wasn't as fast, so he fell behind. The friend who caught up with the OP eventually stopped and turned around to wait for the second friend, but instead screamed that there was something behind their friend and it was chasing him. The OP thought his buddy was just trying to mess with his other friend, but when he turned and looked back, he saw something straight out of a nightmare. The creature he saw giving chase was approximately 12 feet in height, according to the OP, white in appearance, and no wider than him. He says it was silent, fast, and only about a foot or two behind their friend who had fallen behind. One quick look at this enormous creature was enough motivation for him to get out of there and do it in a hurry. The boys were able to make it safely out of the woods and onto the street where one of his friends lived. They made their way to his friend's house, freaked out and scared half to death, where they discussed what they saw, determining that it was not an animal nor was it human. They eventually turned to the internet to seek answers, where they found an old Canadian legend that fit what they saw. It was at that point that they were almost 100% certain that what chased them out of the forest was a Wechuge. Everything they found and read about this creature fit what they saw earlier that night. The OP goes on to say that he posted his story online because he was unsure what to do moving forward. He says he knows now that demons are real and he very much wishes that he didn't. What happened to him has had a lasting effect, as he is now afraid to even walk down the street by himself because he's afraid of something stalking or hunting him. He now wishes he hadn't gone down the Wechuge rabbit hole and found out as much as he did about the creature. He ends his post by again saying that he doesn't know what to do. The first thing I would tell the OP to do would be to stay out of that forest, which I'm sure he is already doing if he doesn't even want to walk down the street by himself. It doesn't seem like this creature attached itself to them or took an interest in them, as this was the only post about it. That's definitely a good thing and makes me think it was just trying to chase the boys out of its territory. However, I'd hate to imagine what would have happened if it had caught one of them. Another thing I want to point out here is something I often see in these stories, and it's the fact that this encounter seems to have taken away his sense of security. He no longer feels safe even walking down his own street. I always talk about how much of a shame it is when this happens. No one deserves to have this happen to them, especially someone so young. As for what this thing was, it's hard for me to say based on the lack of details given about its physical appearance. So I'll just have to take the OP's word for it that it matched almost exactly what he saw and read about Wechuges online. Only he and his friends know for sure what they saw that night. But that could also be said for any story you hear or read online. What do you think chased these boys out of the forest? And what advice would you give the OP? And that's going to do it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed these stories. If you'd like to hear more stories like these and other types of cryptids, make sure to subscribe to the channel. If you want to send me your story, I'd love to read it. My email is wolfwhocriedcryptid@gmail.com. I will also put it in the description below. With your permission, I may want to use it in an episode. Even if you'd prefer that I didn't share your story on my channel and just want someone to listen, email me. We can privately talk about your encounter. And please remember to keep it civil in the comments section. No one deserves to be ridiculed whether they believe or not. Thank you for listening. I'll catch you at the next episode.